Hi, everyone. Welcome to the class speaker series. For those of you who have not joined us yet, this is a ongoing series that we host some of our new associated faculty, some visiting scholars that are coming to the Center for Latin American Studies here at Pitt, and we are created it as an occasion for people to share their research and for us to be, this hub to connect people, to connect research, and to connect new ideas. So today we have Lisa Ortiz, who is a assistant professor of language literacy and culture in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Leading here at Pitt, and she's been working with several topics related to Latino, Latinx studies, including the one that she will talk to us about today, living and laboring with the presence of Puerto Rican migration, which is, of course, a very, very relevant topic, nowadays for us. So, Lisa, thank you very much for coming, and we are very, very happy to have you close to class.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Buen provecho. I hope you're enjoying the food. Thank you all for being here. For those also on Zoom, thank you for joining to the Center for Latin American Studies for the invitation, and to everyone who worked on making this talk possible. Before I get started, I just want to share a QR code for the paper I will be reading today if anybody is interested in following along. I think maybe for those on Zoom, there might be link drops in the chat. Maybe. Feel free to follow along. And I just want to let you know that as I share quotes by participants, I will be honoring their responses to me in Spanish, but there will be English translations as well on the slides. So as we think about Puerto Rico at this moment, it is so interesting to me to notice how so many people that I encounter think about the islands via popular culture, especially through Benito Antonio Martinez Ocasio, otherwise known as, does anybody know? Bad Bunny. Exactly, Bad Bunny. And so I want to begin by my talk by joining the hype as someone who admittedly doesn't really follow him like that. So in January, Bad Bunny released his album, Debí tirar más fotos. I should have taken more pictures. The speed and intensity with which the songs made their mark were remarkable. And once I let go of my resistance and followed the demands of family and friends to listen to the songs, I understood why a colleague suggested La Mudanza in particular. So I want to play the video for you to get a sense of what I'll be talking about. And I have just a few, maybe you can share. Maybe you can share the English translation of the song here.
Benito, hijo de Benito, le decían.
I think this is the loudest.
El mayor de 6 trabajando desde chamaquito, guiando camiones como el pai y el abuelo. Aunque su sueño siempre fue ser ingeniero, un día Tonito lo invitó para hacer una mudanza, para buscar salguito, par de pesos, para el alcanza.
Apparently this is the loudest they can play. Let me start over.
Porque en la mudanza Benito, hijo de Benito, le decían Tito, el mayor de 6 trabajando desde chamaquito, guiando camiones como el pai y el abuelo. Aunque su sueño siempre fue ser ingeniero, Benito lo invitó. Le decía
Yeah,
Tito, el
I think
mayor de
that's his
6,
loud.
trabajando desde chamaquito, guiando camiones como el pai y el abuelo. Aunque su sueño siempre fue ser ingeniero, un día Tonito lo invitó para hacer una mudanza, para buscarse alguito, par de pesos, para algo alcanza. Gracias a Dios que ese día no estaba bici, porque en la mudanza fue donde conoció a Lizzy, la menor de 3 que se criaron con doña Juanita, porque su papá y mamá partieron estando chiquita. Prometió graduarse antes de casarse y lo cumplió diciembre del 9-2. Con Tito se casó antes de irse para Almirante, donde se conocieron, vivieron en Morovi, en donde hicieron el nene, que en Bayamón por primera vez vieron. Un aplauso para mami y papi, porque en verdad rompieron. Gracias mami por parirme aquí. Ey, el mejor de la nueva porque me crié en la vieja. Gracias a mami y papi por todos los jalos no reja. Nunca me han visto en la calle ni en los podcasts ando queja. Tratan de medir fuerza y no pueden ni en pareja. Calle el sol, calle luna, estrella en la noche oscura. Yo no canto reggae, pero sí cultura de Borinquen, PR, archipiélago perfecto. En el mundo entero ya conocen mi dialecto, mi jerga. A mí me importa un bicho lo que a ti te vale verga. Aquí mataron gente por sacar la bandera. Por eso es que ahora yo la llevo donde quiera, cabrón, ¿qué fue? Está peligroso. Si mañana muero, espero que nunca olviden mi rostro. Pongan un tema mío el día que traigan a Otto. En la caja la bandera azul clarito. Y que recuerden que siempre fui yo, siempre fui Benito. Métele más que yo, tú eres loco. Cabrón, tú eres loco. Lo que tú digas, me importa poco. A mí me quieren como a ti, y sin serio como Coto. Lugia, oh, oh. Cabrón, yo soy legendario. La meto con cojones y con ovario. Millonario sin dejar de ser del barrio. Pa' que sepa. Aprieta, chamaquito, aprieta. De aquí nadie me saca, de aquí yo no me muevo. Dile que esta es mi casa, donde nació mi abuelo. De aquí nadie me saca, de aquí yo no me muevo. Dile que esta es mi casa, donde nació mi abuelo. Yo soy el país familiar.
So there's a lot to unpack there. And unfortunately, we don't have time to do that today. But the reason I highlight the song, La Mudanza, is because part of what it does is that it represents a strong sentiment that many Puerto Ricans in the archipelago hold. A commitment to stay in Puerto Rico, to not be pushed or pulled out. It also includes, though, a recognition that his dialect has been heard all around the world. And so if we use for these purposes Puerto Ricans who sound like he does in place of his dialect, then we can conclude a recognition of other Puerto Ricans in other places, mainly outside of Puerto Rico. In another song, Lo que le pasó a Hawaii, What Happened to Hawaii, where he offers a cautionary tale about US colonialism, with Puerto Rico being a US colony and Puerto Ricans as colonial subjects despite US citizenship, for those who might not be familiar. He describes, quote, a struggling woman, probably from the countryside by his use of the word jibara, who hasn't given in, who also did not want to leave, who stayed in the island until who knows when, end quote. His point about not giving up or giving in, I should say, is quite similar to debates about hashtag Yo no me quito, I don't give up, a campaign hotly debated in 2016, which was interpreted as an attack against Puerto Ricans who were migrating in heightened numbers. In the song La Mudanza, we can see how Bad Bunny's story tells about his grandparents and his parents, how he anchors Puerto Rico specifically, and also how he holds space beyond it, how he is clear about his groundedness there while also being elsewhere. Scholars have examined similar practices through very theoretical approaches, with this slide just showing some perspectives. In many ways, what Bad Bunny put forth is related to what I observed during my research with Puerto Ricans who engaged with migration between the rural town of Jayuya, Puerto Rico, and the town of Rantoul in central Illinois. What I will share today is part of an article manuscript under review, so I welcome all the feedback that you might have for me. The data is part of a larger study I conducted regarding intergenerational migration of Puerto Ricans between both regions. When I submitted the title of my talk today, I felt strongly about how some people decide to stay in Puerto Rico. However, I realized that staying is more complex, right, than not leaving. It is not a monolithic decision, nor is it all encompassing. So my focus today explores the intimacy embedded within these larger debates. Some of the questions I ask are, with so much attention on Puerto Ricans leaving Puerto Rico, what makes someone decide to stay? And what does staying actually mean? What does it look like? If we take as truth that migration is part of Puerto Rican culture, which so many of us as Puerto Ricans have heard and maybe said, a useful approach to understanding how it plays out in people's lives is to explore how those in Puerto Rico navigate its quotidian nature. How have they negotiated the movement of loved ones? What conversations do they have? Do they desire to stay, aspire to leave, or decide somewhere in between? My aim is to explore the experiences of three mothers of adult migrants, Breilín, Clorinda, and Doña Greta, as it relates to where they decided to live, work, and keep place, and how this might deepen our understanding of additional Puerto Rican migration experiences. So before I continue, let me provide a bit of context of the three women that I'll be talking about and the places that I'm referring to. Here's the slide. As you can see, two of the three women have lived in Puerto Rico and New York or Chicago, and one has always lived in Puerto Rico and only visited Illinois. Two of them have mainly worked in the home, although I'll be talking a little bit about what labor for them looked like. And one was a retired public servant when we spoke. As you can see, they also have ranged in age. Age was not a defining factor in the design of my larger project, but stressing it here offers insights into the experiences of older migrants who, when it comes to public attention about those who migrate and those who remain, are sometimes dismissed as an aging, questionably productive part of the population. And here I'm thinking especially of the political analysis I listen to via an app in the mornings about how they talk about of the adult population that is remaining in Puerto Rico. That is, it is if their worth can only reside alongside economic measures that benefit and do not burden the archipelago. My emphasis on age needs to be taken with care, clearly ranging between 49 and 61. Formal age group categories would not include the woman as older adults, since this group is typically 65 or older. Thus, I refer to participants in ways that attempt to respect how they saw themselves as women, mothers, and becoming older by using descriptions such as mothers of older migrants or adult children. However, during our interactions, it was clear that others and I respected and treated the women as older adults, as our elders. Although this paper does not showcase the woman's, quote, voices, perspectives, and experiences of growing old, as Merida Rua encourages us to do within Latinx studies, it joins scholarship that seeks to show how older Puerto Ricans negotiate place and the presence of migration as it relates to their age and also their autonomy. That is, it privileges their voices instead of showcasing the voices and opinions that their adult migrant children had for them. Breilín, Clorinda, and Doña Greta's firsthand knowledge about Rantoul began in 2007 and 2015, respectively. In 2007, Clorinda's daughter was the first woman to join a group of Puerto Ricans hired to work in what Spanish speakers in the area called La Marranera. Employers of a pork plant traveled to Jayuya to hire Puerto Ricans because the human resources employee at the factory had family there and reportedly considered the hiring a win-win opportunity. The 2007 contract work was short-lived, but it created a way for family and friends to consider moving. Indeed, since 2012, and especially in 2015, social networks shaped the migration of Puerto Ricans mainly from Jayuya to Rantoul, like that of Brayling and Doña Greta's daughters. Although there is a stark contrast between Jayuya and the tropical islands and the Rantoul in the US Midwest, both are rural regions that have faced economic challenges. They have also been remembered for salient reasons. And I'm using here rural to describe Rantoul in particular, because technically it wouldn't be considered rural in terms, right, of like legal definitions or formal definitions, but certainly that's how the participants that I spoke with describe the area. In fact, describing them both like Rantoul es como Jayuya. They both also have been remembered for salient reasons. For example, Jayuya annually commemorates the 1950 revolution and holds indigenous-related events. Rantoul is considered to have had relative cosmopolitanism in the early to mid-20th century because of its Air Force base. Both places also engaged around the same time in marketing initiatives to attract tourism. So despite a sentiment of publicly processing migration en masse, that's a quote, that made the rounds in 2015, I was still surprised when I heard mothers of adult migrants refuse to leave their hometown. Sitting together at the kitchen table or over food elsewhere, I became intrigued with how the women I spoke with talked about their decisions to stay in Puerto Rico and remain connected to Rantoul. By then, I had become accustomed to noticing how participants in my larger project would offer the economy as the driving factor, right, behind their reasons to leave, followed by other explanations that do not always get attention, such as religious callings, desiring to start anew, or escaping domestic violence. I had also become accustomed to manifestations like those in Bad Bunny's recent album that I showed the song from, and other public rhetoric on staying. Many times couched in virtuous rationales of making patria in the patria, building the nation. Yet these mothers seem to be offering an alternative or additional narrative, and this paper is my attempt to tell that story. I focus on how these three mothers negotiated the presence of migration in their lives by showing how such negotiation entailed a relational process of staying grounded in Puerto Rico while utilizing their loved ones' migration in the US as opportunities to sporadically labor. This isn't necessarily new, right? But in the context of the rural regions in Puerto Rico, not necessarily discussed all that much. I argue that as non-passive agents of their lives, these women labored and lived within emerging diasporic communities. By engaging and keeping pace with the broader practice of placemaking in and outside of Puerto Rico, at their age and where they were, they offer additional examples of Puerto Rican migration stories that go beyond public descriptions. So placekeeping in the making. From no visits to prolonged stays, how Brayling, Clorinda, and Doña Greta, and others related to Rantoul varied. I interpret their inclinations as gestures toward a consideration of space, place, and placemaking. Is anyone here in architecture or planning or design? No. Okay, so those concepts are typically, I'm not going to go into the genealogy of the Puerto Rican scholars who have worked on space and place, nor the interdisciplinary scholars who have discussed Latinx placemaking, is particularly in the Midwest. But these concepts, we now understand them to go beyond architecture, planning, and design, those fields, and to really think about and realize how placemaking goes also beyond like public longstanding structures. And for our purposes in Pittsburgh, we could think about like the monuments in honor of Roberto Clemente, right, here in Pittsburgh. Those would be examples of public longstanding placemaking efforts. Placemaking, though, is also ephemeral, as Teresa Delgadillo and colleagues have written about, and it is also private and non-recurring, as I have also proposed. These actions are always tied to power in some way. Power also resides in actions that do not always appear to reach the level of making place. And so I ask, how do individuals help transform space into place, engage in placemaking practices, yet not feel fully motivated to live in that given place? I propose expanding our understanding of placemaking as a process that is not only public, private, collective, longstanding, and ephemeral, but that also includes keeping place elsewhere, not only existing in relation to the place. Reflecting on what I learned, it became clear that the mothers knew how to strategize beyond the binary of fully staying or fully leaving Puerto Rico. In placekeeping, they do not let go of home in Puerto Rico, and they do not let go of possibilities in Rentoul. Such approach could be similar to circular migration, or even when I was condensing this paper for this talk, transnational migration also came to mind. Yet there is a sense of intimacy and personhood that is recognized in the act of placemaking that is not quite present when referring to the broad phenomenon of circular migration. By keeping place, there is both a refusal of forced displacement and also a refusal of warm invitations to migrate. Thus, intentionally or not, a power play where the mothers make the decisions to navigate in between. I see placekeeping and placemaking intricately connected, I think still. I'm not sure if that'll change by the time I finish this manuscript. But also beyond simply maintaining property, for example. I locate placekeeping within the broader practice of placemaking and observe it transpiring in the fluid moments of being where one claims home and also where one claims another place where value is attached. Where keeping place in one region is possible as is making place intimately in another. My examination of how the mothers of adult migrants I spoke with describe the presence of migration in their lives seeks to show the relationship between migration and diasporic formations with and without movement, shaping how placekeeping emerges as a practice to keep connections and influences how the life of the Rentoul diaspora transpires. By focusing on an expansive placemaking that includes keeping place, in relational ways, I show the everydayness of living with the presence of migration. So, part 1 of 2, no estamos para eso, living in Puerto Rico. Get back here soon. Okay, so Breilín, Clorinda, and Doña Greta had to deal with frequent conversations about moving or not moving. The topic was not out of place, so mothers were not surprised when their children migrated, sharing statements such as, pues mira que no me sorprendí. Ya yo estaba adaptada que en un momento dado ella se iba a ir. La primera fue Jerica, porque ella siempre ha sido aventurera, así como he sido yo. With most of their children living in Rentoul, the woman would be encouraged to leave Puerto Rico to be closer to them. Micaela, Doña Greta's second oldest daughter, was quite vocal about wanting her parents to live with her in the US. But Doña Greta would not give in, and here note my own invocation of this discourse despite critiquing it, right? Couching her rationale in age and in health while knowing she could keep open ties with family, she explained to me, Micaela quiere que nos vayamos para allá. Pero yo de vacaciones, tú sabes, para ir a ver a los nietos y para estar con ella, pero para quedarme, nada. Nosotros estamos viejos y enfermos, refiriéndose al esposo también. No estamos para eso, para vivir no. Los muchachos están locos. Micaela y la hermana nos pagan el pasaje y todo. Doña Greta's reasoning for not leaving was grounded in the knowledge that she could keep place in Jayuya while still seeing her loved ones during temporary visits to Rentoul. I read her description of herself and her husband, Don Raúl, by health and age as one that does not fit neat assumptions. Interestingly, Doña Greta relied on age and health conditions as reasons to stay, contrary to exploring migration in search of a purported universal better quality of life. Yet she did not reduce themselves as incapable of traveling altogether because of these factors. In addition to grappling with her children's desires, Doña Greta also faced some pressure from her husband. Elaborating on what moving to a place new to them would entail, she joked with me about him also being crazy, just like their kids. Él iba a vender todo. Como él es mayor de edad, mi esposo tiene 71. Sabes, no es fácil para una persona mayor. Y enfermo, él es diabético. Él iba a vender todo. Es que no piensa. Yo le dije, no puede ser así porque tú no sabes. Y si no nos gusta, ¿dónde vamos a meternos? No tenemos dónde meternos para volver para atrás. Entonces él estaba loco, quería irse para allá. Los muchachos le decían que había muchos beneficios para él y es verdad, para él sí. Allá le ayudan un montón, pero yo digo, ¿quién nos va a carretear? Micaela va a estar trabajando, va a estar pendiente a sus hijos, no vamos al trabajo de ella también. Y después habló con el nene más chiquito y él nos dijo, mami, ¿y si no se acostumbran? Y en eso nos mudamos para acá, para la casita. Doña Greta's questions encompass meticulous thinking about what everyday living would look like after migrating. But what could appear as an impulsive decision on her husband's part was a strategy of survival. At the time, they had to move out of the house they had lived in for decades due to familial discrepancies of ownership. Faced with possible homelessness, it made sense for Don Raúl to think of migrating. After all, it would not have been the first time he lived in the States, proudly telling me that when he was younger, he worked in tobacco fields in Connecticut. The reason they did not ultimately move was because they were able to live in a small structure that they fixed into the most possible living conditions. Doña Greta showed a level of concern about dependency and autonomy. She did not expect to live with her children. She did not expect for her children to care for them, nor did she see herself as the caretaker of her grandchildren. She recognized that moving would entail a type of solitude when others were away at work. If the reason to leave was to be close to family, and yet the degree of closeness varied because of labor demands, then such closeness did not suffice to leave Puerto Rico. The emotional pull was not completely there. Similar to Doña Greta, Clorinda did not make decisions based on what her children desired, but left the option to migrate open. When I asked if she would leave, she based her answer on a religious calling. Que sea para la obra de Dios, no porque yo quiera irme porque están mis hijas allá. Yo las amo, yo las quiero, me hacen falta, pero viajo y las veo. Clorinda did not see herself leaving Puerto Rico because of the social networks that historically and continuously motivate ongoing migration. She was content with her life in Jayuya, having worked outside of the home for many years. Her point about serving God as a motivating factor to migrate was not abstract. I was invited to the Women's Congress Church event she helped organize and co-lead, which is where I met her. Perhaps the most financially stable of the three mothers, she traveled to Rantoul every year, sometimes twice. Thus, such access could explain why she, under very different circumstances than Doña Greta, decided that she did not feel the need to migrate to Rantoul. Similar to the other mothers, Breilin did not make decisions on where to live based on her children. Interestingly, hers was based on the rationale of her children needing to be independent, which she still tied to her own potential health issues in the future. Ahora nos tienen a nosotros, pero imagínate en un momento dado que uno, refiriéndose a ella misma, se enferme. Llega un momento y caes en un hospital y sucede algo contigo. ¿Cuánto sufrirían ellos? And believing that her children should be able to live without her, she offers a hypothetical situation regarding care and health that could be interpreted as intersecting with age. Her words, y llega un momento, then a moment comes, suggest an immediate future or long-term one in which she would be at an older age. If she were still close to them, they would not be able to manage the possible difficulties of her becoming ill. That is, she did not think she should move because to Rantoul in the event that this were to happen. However, contrary to the other mothers, she did not reject the idea of leaving either. At 49 at the time, Breilin was the youngest of the three and was perhaps less concerned about age in relation to migration, which might not be surprising. She had been to Rantoul twice in the 2 years that her daughter had moved there. When I asked if she would stay, she explained that her husband was briefly working as a mechanic in Rantoul during those 6 weeks that he had been visiting, and shared with me that pienso de más tardecito cuando mi esposo regrese, dejar unas cosas que tenemos que arreglar en la casa y ver si podemos ir por un tiempito. Although Breilin did not talk about migrating per se, she was interested in experimenting with an extended stay. By taking into account when to leave, what she needed to resolve before doing so, and how to maintain her house in Puerto Rico, she situated herself as keeping place in Jayuya and in Rantoul. For Breilin, Clorinda, and Doña Greta, living with the presence of migration included repeated requests from their adult migrant children to consider leaving, all of their children already had their own families. Despite that their reasons for staying and potentially moving in the future varied, the three mothers all made decisions based on themselves and not on expectations of what they should perhaps be expected to do as mothers thinking about what aging livelihoods would look like. Their actions to speak up, to challenge others, to say no when they did not fully agree nor desire such a major change in their life, and to also allow themselves to consider that precise change resembles an autonomy not necessarily imagined of adult women in rural places such as Jayuya, as I was told when I was in the field. Of note, these mothers did not stay for altruistic reasons, much like what can appear on social and news media, nor were they staying because of assumed conformist attitudes. I think it's more complicated than that, right? The women did not claim to make patria by staying, but by doing so, they were keeping patria, holding onto their homelands without judging kin who left by feeling they could stay and choosing to do so. Placekeeping. So for the second part, si yo voy, yo puedo conseguir trabajo, laboring in Rantoul, and this is right, like sort of the flip. The reality and reminder of migration in the lives of these women also represented a way for them to take ownership of how they labored, including some of the forms of labor that historian Carmen Whalen describes as, quote, reproductive and subsistence work, paid employment within and beyond the household, informal economic activities, and community work, both paid and unpaid. Doña Greta did not engage in the practice of circular labor. Clorinda and Breilin did though. Deciding to stay did not exclude the possibility of leaving or visiting with a one-way ticket. Unsurprisingly, not being completely close to the idea of potentially living in Rantoul in the future, Clorinda and Breilin dabbled with working or thinking about working there. Breilin entertained the possibility of moving in the future because she would have a place to stay immediately upon arrival. However, if she were to move, she aspired to live separately and to quizás hasta trabajar, in her words. Ahora mismo yo sé que los trabajos de fábrica, si yo voy, me puedo conseguir trabajo. Yo la otra vez me fui y cuidé nenes el mes que estuve y me gané unos chavos. Breilin's knowledge about the ease with which she could find manufacturing work stemmed from a practice that several Puerto Ricans explored in Rantoul. Contrary to other smaller rural areas whose economies depend solely on one factory, and here I'm thinking about the work of anthropologist Cristina Ortiz in Iowa, Rantoul and its neighboring towns provided numerous employment options that ranged in focus and that were in relatively close proximity. Returning to Breilin, having witnessed the successful hires of loved ones gave her a sense of security. Yet she had already found ways and arguably could repeat them to sustain herself in Rantoul. That she chose to also work while helping her daughter after surgery illuminates her autonomy to not only be at the disposal of her daughter, but to also do something for herself. While watching children for her pay, she temporarily helped Puerto Ricans who had been making residence in Rantoul and making place and keeping place themselves. Thinking about care and childcare in particular came up in my conversation with Doña Greta. At the time of our interview, she had not visited Rantoul, but she had had her own experience with traveling for work decades prior, which helps us remember the historical nature of Puerto Rican domestic care work, whether documented or not, and especially in Chicago. When Doña Greta was in her teens, she went from working at home while her parents worked in La Finca to caring for an older woman to then moving to the Bronx to work. She said, cuando tenía 19 años, me fui para allá afuera con unas primas mías para eso mismo. En lo que ella trabajaba, yo le cuidaba a los nenes. Ese era el trabajo mío y después, pues, ama de casa. Lo que estuve fue como un año o algo así cuando estuve allá afuera en Nueva York, cerca del Bronx o algo así por ahí. Doña Greta's memory of her age, how long she was in New York and where she lived precisely was blurry when we talked, but she remembered liking it despite returning because of how close she was with her parents. Her example of laboring and living in New York, while not current, is indicative of the ways Puerto Rican women have continuously worked to sustain themselves and others, in formal and informal ways. Clorinda did not describe herself as working in Rantoul the times we spoke. However, she played a role in the church and did not discount continuing in its future. Cuando Cristian sea el pastor, yo tomaría una decisión para ir a ayudarlo. Ya yo había predicado en otras ocasiones desde el 2011 por ahí. Working here becomes porous, right? Clorinda had been involved with the church because of her frequent trips to Rantoul. She told me her daughter had suggested how to make money by renting her house in Jayuya and start in Rantoul, a plan that she described as exciting. But she did not act on this because she was waiting for some sort of sign, which would depend on the formal designation of Pastor Christian or Cristian at the church she helped with. With him at the helm, Clorinda saw herself as having a purpose in Rantoul that went beyond her children. Her commitment to the church, whether paid or not, was labor, and she now planned moments in her life around this. By working during her visits, Clorinda made place in and outside of the church. She created relationships with different groups and was keeping place in Rantoul and in Jayuya. Thinking with the stories of those becoming older adults can help remember the textured lives people live. The ways in which these mothers made decisions about traveling and working in the US, whether in the past or their then present, makes clear that staying is not a simple act of never leaving, nor is it an era of nothingness or despair. These women found ways to make their circumstances work for them, even if official accounts of productivity for economic gains in the islands do not acknowledge these practices. Focusing on human capital and economic measures might be insightful for many, but so too is understanding how older adults or those becoming older adults experience life amid migration rhetoric and realities. The public discourse on older people in Puerto Rico tends to flatten their personhood and forget how they keep community, livelihoods, and places. The examples I have shared offer a reminder to pause prior to anchoring reasons for staying within heroic reasons to keep patria. Why women remained were not spectacular reasons, nor did they include spectacular announcements. Additionally, these were not claims to virtuous motherhood of leaving because of societal expectations about what a mother or a partner should do, right? Like follow your children, follow your husband. And so as I close, I want to return to La Mudanza because it does, after all, translate to the move. However, we might want to interpret that from one house to another, or from one home to another, or from one place to another, or somewhere in between. Part of what I think made Bad Bunny's album remarkable for Puerto Ricans everywhere, and I know for many who are not Puerto Rican as well, is that I think that it offered an unapologetic stance and commitment for Puerto Ricans to keep Puerto Rico, whether in the warm January on the islands or its coldness in Pittsburgh, which is when I listened to it in January. Less noticeably, Braylin, Clorinda, and Doña Greta are also part of those who are keeping Puerto Rico in more than one place. So when social epidemiologist Matos Moreno and colleagues predict that regarding Puerto Rican older adults, quote, future generations will have an increased presence of transnational family members, end quote, we might lean into these possibilities, which are not new in form, even if they are in scale, rather than assume a lack of relational practices between loved ones as they grow older in different places. Thank you.
Benito, hijo de Benito, le decían Tito.
We're not going to hear you. Thank you all. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Questions? one of the,
Stop sharing. Sorry, Kayla, you were gonna.
I was just going to say, why people sometimes, people get shy. It's, how can we stop this?
I think I can show the gallery.
Yeah. Honest.
I'll just, yeah.
At least we don't.
Yeah.
See each other like so many times. I was thinking about, how this is so super interesting in the sense of, I think you're approaching this question in a different way because it seems that most of these ideas about migration are about the perspective of the people that move and the reasons why you move. And if it's something that it's like your will, and that those discussions about the act of staying, I'm finding it as someone like so many of us here that have relocated or migrated, it's just so interesting because it's in some ways it's like the everyday question, right? Of why did you move or why did you stay? So
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you have, I understand that maybe there's no like a lot of data from other places, but Puerto Rico having this, of course, super strong relationship with the US, it's a particular case. But if it's possible to think like about Latin America as a whole, of other countries, if there's something similar being.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to explore more in relation to how different communities are deciding to stay with the question of transnational migration, right? Like there's a lot of work on Mexican communities for sure, and communities in the Philippines, right? And thinking about transnational care and transnational migration. With regard to this topic about placekeeping, I haven't thought about it beyond Puerto Rico yet. I'm really interested in trying to think about like the specificity of place, in particular between these two rural regions, because in the context of Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican migration, we haven't really, I think, studied enough, right? These dynamics of rural to rural. And so that's what my focus has been so far. But yeah, I'm not sure about, well, placemaking for sure, but placekeeping and how that might relate in the broader Latin American context.
Yeah.
I see. Anadi, and then
So maybe you mentioned this or not, but it makes me think of older generations also keeping or placekeeping culture and passing it on future generations that might migrate or not. It's just maybe what I'm just thinking. This is not a question, but this is what it keeps the culture going, like older generations doing this placekeeping in their countries.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you mentioned that, because I think that these mothers and grandmothers are staying in touch, right? They're using FaceTime, they're using WhatsApp, they're doing Facebook Lives, or their kids are doing Facebook Lives, right? And so you're getting a sense of like what's happening in one place and people experiencing in another. And in the same ways, they're still holding on to some traditions and sharing those traditions, right? But also still having conversations with, so the grandmothers, like an example, talking with her grandchildren about some of the things that they did, or the traditions that they held in Hayuya, right? And maintaining those. So those conversations, at least I would say one of the families that I spoke with, are definitely happening, right? That where that culture is being, but I'm excited also about the ways in which like even the cultural practices move, right? And I think that we're seeing that in Rantoul, like in terms of the celebration of El Dia de los Reyes, right? Like the Three Kings Days and things like that, where I was surprised when I went and saw that, oh, you all are celebrating this year, like, you know, in this, in a space where we might not imagine. So it's interesting also to see how folks are creating those or maintaining those cultural practices. Angie?
Thanks, Lisa, for sharing your very interesting work with us. I was curious to think a little bit more about how the participants in your study might be different than people who choose to leave, right? So the literature on like theories of migration says that people who stay are different from people who leave. And so I wonder if you could provide any insight on that.
Different in what way do you mean? Or
well, essentially like the decision to leave, you know, like you said, is not an easy one, right? Yeah. And so, you know, migrants like are selected in that way, right? Like they select into this idea of migrating, right? So the people who migrate are just fundamentally different from the people who stay on like a whole range of characteristics, like broadly speaking.
yeah, I don't think I think about them like these groups as different entirely, or at least I don't approach my work in that way. I find it fascinating. Of course, the people who were recruited to the factory in 2007 were like, there was a whole host of practices happening there, right? That you get this recruitment, and this, of course, I didn't go into details about this in the paper, but Puerto Ricans get recruited because of the immigration rates that were happening in Illinois at the time, right? And so that's why they go. So I think that the people who said yes to being recruited to go work were not necessarily any different from the people who might have stayed, but that they decided that they had some very particular life circumstances. So one of the women, for example, decided to leave, not because she didn't have a job, as like the public rhetoric, I think, is, right? Like, you don't have employment or you don't make enough. She was fine with her employment, but she was escaping domestic violence, right? And so that's a very particular context. I think with the folks that I met and the work that I did, I think it's a little bit more blurry than like one group different from the other, right? And I think it has to do with the relationships that people hold on to. And so people have come and gone, like they've returned, they've decided, you know what, this was not for me, or they've decided to come and go and come and go, sort of circular. So I don't know, like, I'm not sure that I want to make those sort of definitive like distinctions. But I will say like that everyone in some way is seeking, which is not different, but rather similar, finding ways to create livelihoods, right? In ways that would still keep them in touch with each other, and the possibilities of keeping relationships. Yeah. Yes.
I've long lived by the notion that there is no such thing as an unmixed motive. Do things for one reason. Your subjects stated their reasons for making choices. I wonder if there are unspoken reasons, and if you have questions you can ask them to get at those unspoken reasons. For example, you just spoke of the woman who left to escape domestic violence. When she left, what reason did she state for her leaving?
Yeah, thank you for
saying, I'm leaving to get away from domestic violence, or did she say, this is a great place for opportunity? You see what I mean? What are the unspoken reasons that people make the choices?
Yeah, that actually, her answer actually was not the first answer that she provided. I think all of my participants in some way or another were talking like, the economy was sort of that go-to answer, right? At the beginning, it was kind of like, yeah, for a better quality of life was not the answer that the majority of them actually gave. Or it was like, oh, to progress, or that the schools are better, right? For those who were parents. But then in conversation, for the woman, her name is Jerica, or her pseudonym is Jerica, she had mentioned, you know, as soon as she found out that they were recruiting in Jayuya to work at a pork plant, she knew that was her opportunity to leave, is what she said. And so when I was like, what do you mean your opportunity to leave? Did you not have work? Or did, you know, like what was happening? That's when she then expanded on her answer, right? And then having to figure out, like, sharing how she provided a different phone number so that they wouldn't, like, she lied to her partner and said, yeah, they're gonna call you, but in fact, you know, she gave a different phone number. And so it was a plan, sort of, right, a way for her to escape domestic violence, so that way she could leave, be the one to be called, get recruited. And she returned for a short while to Puerto Rico after, not with that partner, and then returned again to Puerto Rico. So for sure, not everyone gave one sole reason. And I think in general, I think that's what's fascinating, and what helps us really not jump to these conclusions, at least in the context of Puerto Rico, where everyone was talking about, like, yeah, because the economy is so bad, and because of you know, like this broad sort of abstract reason. And then when you talk to folks, you could get a sense of different reasons. Like, everybody that I spoke with actually had employment when they left, with the exception of one person. So that was really surprising to me, because, you know, you go in hearing all of this public rhetoric and narrative that there aren't any jobs. And so it might be like, yeah, you know, I imagine this as a better opportunity in the States, right? Or I'm gonna make more money than what I made in Puerto Rico. So it was also like thinking about that in relation to each other. Did that?
Yes,
answer?
well, and on the flip side, what might be some of the unspoken reasons for why your three main subjects didn't want to move permanently to Ortiz? Might there be unspoken reasons? Tensions.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if part of it was fear, but we didn't engage in that. Like, sometimes I wondered, you know, was it fear of, you know, like leaving or starting anew, right? Yeah. But I appreciate that question, because it allows me to think also about what else, about the absences, which I think are always telling, right? Just as well as what they did say. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for your presentation. It was so great. I was not expecting Bad Bunny at all. I just texted my friend like, oh, it would be so nice if she talked about Bad Bunny. And when you started, I was like, no way. Thank you.
But you're welcome.
I would like, you mentioned the movement Yo No Me Quito. I would like to know if that resurfaced or not. Like, what is like right now? I know all the Bad Bunny album and everything that his story in there, and there's a lot of commotion around it. And after all, he is one of the most played musicians on Spotify and everywhere. But I would like to also ask you besides that, because I think that's very difficult to to claim a certain kind of nationhood when we're being colonized. As a Brazilian person, I think about that all the time, because Bad Bunny is doing it right now. Brazilian musicians do it for a long time, but also we have the same here with Kendrick Lamar when he sings "They're Not Like Us." So I would like to ask you if how you see that, because when Bad Bunny presents his story with his country, with Puerto Rico, he's like putting it in a very intimate place. But when we think more like, I don't know, historically, maybe, I think that's almost impossible to not think about also what is the state, what is nation, and something like that. I don't know if I can, it's just popping in my mind, so I don't know if I can explain, but I think there's a difference between how we claim our nation somehow, and at the same time, that's very difficult, because how we build the nation as we perceive it today is very different, and is through colonial lines. So I don't know if that comes up when you're asking people as well, because I think that's a very difficult thing to do sometimes. When how we can claim something that was always taken from us.
Yeah, no, I mean, those are fascinating points. And so I want to say something first, right? Like Bad Bunny is not the first one to, in the context of Puerto Rico, as you mentioned, to make these claims, right? There are several musicians, like, right, if we do look into that history, a lot of like good work, both in Puerto Rico and outside of Puerto Rico, that have been like making these claims for a long time. So just to put that out there, right? Because I do think in some ways, maybe people think that only Bad Bunny is the one that's like, making noise and doing all these things. And for sure, he's not the first or the only one. I understand your point. So with my research, I didn't go into conversations with participants about how they thought about nationhood or making nation or keeping nation or right or like critiques of the state. The father, so Doña Greta's husband at times talked about like his clear recognition of the state creating the conditions, right, for people to have to live apart, for families to have to live apart, right? So there is a recognition of the state, not necessarily that these are like individual choices, right? That choice can be questioned. But I don't know that I want to give, like, I understand what you're saying that we're colonized, right? But I think there's still something there, right? That we can't give it all, like, we can't like give it all to the state, right? And I think that those are the exciting things, right? That where people are creating these very intimate, small, quote unquote, or engaging in these practices that go beyond what the state might want, right? That like being here and being there, not letting go, making money in ways that, you need to, and whether or not you report that or how, right? Like that's not for the state to decide. So I think that there are like these everyday practices that despite that colonial condition that's imposed, people find ways, right, to circumvent, right? That there are other practices that are happening. And his video or his song, his album is one example of that, but I think every day there are people, and of course he relies on that, right? He relies on all the efforts from so many others to amplify those messages. So I don't know if I answered your question, but and your comment, but I appreciate the ideas there for me to think about more. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. This is a fabulous presentation. I'm sorry I'm late, so if you want to address my questions in presentation, I'm happy to just talk after about it. But I wondered what was most surprising for you in your discussions with these women, aside from whatever else you've already shared, which is also super fascinating. And then I was also really interested in how in hearing more from you about what I perceive as like your very flexible, in a good way, flexible understanding of labor and place, right? Because it's so central to how you have envisioned this project.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the most surprising for me, or one of the most surprising, is that, these 3 women lived in Puerto Rico and had homes and property in Puerto Rico, and the range of conditions varied greatly, right? And so what I found interesting is that, we might, if we rely on popular or like dominant narratives that everybody is leaving, that like, these conditions are horrible, quote unquote, or any like given sort of characteristics that like listening to AM political analysis on an app that as I do instead of listening to Bad Bunny, I might hear, but that actually like women are saying regardless of these conditions, right? So like the home and the structures of the home, not in a conformist way. So that's something I still want to think about a little bit more, right? That they're saying they're in many ways, contrary to what people would think that they would want to live in, right? Like the type of the house, the structures. So that was surprising to me in a way. And your question about hearing more about my flexibility with labor and place. Yeah, so in this the broader work, right, talks about labor. The majority of the people that I interviewed were labor migrants, right? There were people who had been recruited and then followed thereafter and have been engaging in all sorts of labor practices in Rantoul and in Jayuya. And they played with the system, right? So like I mentioned briefly, you know, several of these Puerto Ricans know how to negotiate labor here and there and elsewhere around town. And so I want to honor that because they're the ones that are engaging in that flexibility. And I find it fascinating that they know how to do that. So part of what I'm trying to argue in like this larger project is that within Puerto Rican migration studies, we think a lot about, you know, Puerto Ricans have worked. And of course, you know, I believe that, but usually we don't think about Puerto Ricans as knowers, right? Like that, like the people who work also are people who know, right? Like have ways of knowing and being. And so I'm trying to understand also like knowledge making and these practices of labor and place. And so I know that's not an answer, but I want to keep that flexibility because I think it allows us, right, to understand a variety of experiences instead of just sort of one experiences in the rural, which I think really doesn't, right, you get thought of as like having people who know or are knowledgeable, right? So that's where I'm at right now. Thank you. Yeah.
I got a question regarding place or placemaking and placekeeping, but also thinking about the category of territory or territorio. And I would love to know if you, in your interviews, some data you found something regarding the connection to the territorio itself, in Jayuya or Jayuya or in the other place, in terms of the territory itself, the land, the weather. You mentioned relationships. I'm thinking about that because for me, there is a very good connection between place and the territory itself.
It's interesting because I feel like the people who spoke about land the most were the kids I spoke with. And they talked about how they used to like to go to La Finca with their grandfather to work, to work on the land, to work in the land, how they engaged with animals, right? And how they knew how to work in the lands. And so that was, I think, the most, right, in context with kids that the land came up, or avoiding structures in given territories. So like the father, Doña Greta's husband, who like avoids where his daughter used to live because it's too hurtful. It's too painful for him to see that house, right? And to see that land. And so he doesn't engage with it anymore because that's where like his memory is where she used to live there, right? But engagement with the land per se, I would say came up mostly with children, like with youth. The most, yeah, I would say, and the weather. But territory per se, we didn't go into your conceptualization, because I know that you're thinking about that too. We didn't go into that type of conversations about territory, but definitely about land. The kids made sense of that. And so even if some participants said like, Rancho es como Jayuya, in many ways it's not, right? It's like they don't feel attached to the land, even though their first summer in Rantoul, two of the kids that I spoke with had actually gone to work in the fields to make money, right? And so we're seeing practices of Puerto Rican youth engaging in ways that maybe like, you know, some might not imagine them to be working at, right? And following also in trajectories of like grandparents who had also worked in the fields. But yeah, I'll think about that one.
Yes, you know, we'll continue that discussion over time. And I mean, just thank you so much for all this discussion about the ways in which we're framing our questions, right? Like, why do we leave? Why do we stay? And I'm sure that as me, you know, many of us are just thinking a lot about that in personal, but also like collective ways of, you know, of moving. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all for your questions and comments. This is going to be super helpful as I work the manuscript once I receive reviewer comments.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Next week on Wednesday at 4:30, we're having another talk on by Professor Marta Abreu from Brazil, who is doing research on the slave ship Camargo, and the archaeological research that has been done about this. And also the following one, we have another one on environmental studies also in Brazil. Oh, and I have another one, another announcement. Thank you. From April 3rd to 5th, we're also hosting with the Center for Ethnic Studies Research the conference Latinx Connect with the team Comunidad. This is the Comunidad community, the state of people. So I have here the announcement and also there the program. So please, just register and get, more information there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.